Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Invasive Species Center webinar series. My name is Jen Wagner, and I am the Zooplankton Diagnostics and Research Intern at the Invasive Species Center, and I will be your moderator for today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Invasive Species Center honors the long history of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nations peoples on the lands now known as Canada, and strives to show respect to their ancestors, their communities, and to them individually. We greatly appreciate the significance of the lands, waters, and all living things, and offer our gratitude to Indigenous peoples for the care and teachings about our earth. Our relationships with Indigenous communities are important, and we will continue to listen and learn how we can be in good relationships with Indigenous peoples, the lands and waters, and all living things. The Invasive Species Center acknowledges that our head office is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Batchewana, the Garden River First Nations, as well as the longtime settlement of the Métis people in the Robinson-Huron Treaty area. The Invasive Species Center is a not-for-profit organization that connects stakeholders, knowledge, and technology to prevent the introduction of spread of invasive species that harm Canada's environment, economy, and society. We've got lots of great invasive species resources on our website, including species profiles, best management practices, and more. So check us out at invasivespeciescenter.ca. You can also sign up on our homepage for our newsletter, bi-weekly media scan, and event invitations, which is where you can hear about upcoming webinars as well. The ISC has launched a new invasive species training program that offers virtual courses on topics related to invasive species. We currently have 3 courses available, but we'll be releasing new content regularly, so stay tuned for that. Make sure to check out our website and sign up to receive updates on when these new courses become available. Before we get started with today's webinar, there are a couple of things I would like to mention. There will be time for questions at the end of the webinar, so if you have a question at any time, please type it in the question box and I will read it to our presenter after the webinar. If you are having technical difficulties at any time, please type them in the chat box or respond to the email found in your registration and we will try to resolve it for you. We have also enabled closed captioning, so if you would like to follow along that way, you can turn that on with the closed caption button on your taskbar. And lastly, there will be a very brief survey following the webinar. If you could take some time to fill it out, we would really appreciate it. Today's webinar is titled A Good News Story, Community-Led Stewardship in an Urban Landscape, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Anna Meng. Anna Meng is the Stewardship Ecologist with the Toronto Nature Stewards, also known as TNS, a grassroots initiative to increase volunteer stewardship of Toronto's urban ravines and natural areas. Following her studies in forest and wildlife conservation at the University of Toronto, Anna discovered her passion for applied research and ecological restoration and integrating scientific knowledge with community wisdom. Since the launch of TNS's pilot program in 2001, Anna has been involved in the development of training curriculum, invasive plant information sheets, and building the organization's capacity. Anna's current project explores the intersections between ecological monitoring, information and knowledge, and stewardship practices, action and application. Thank you very much, Anna, for joining us today. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and pass it over to you.
Thank you, Jen, and everyone at the Invasive Species Center for hosting us today. I'm just going to get my screen share set up. Okay. So I wanted to start off by saying thank you to all of you guys who have taken some time out of your day to come and join us. I am so excited to be taking the role of a messenger for Toronto Nature Stewards today and share with you a good news story. So starting off with a bit of a personal story, I grew up in Canada in an immigrant family, mostly with business people and engineers. So my interest in nature and bugs and rocks and squirrels was definitely perceived as odd or different. I remember being about 14 or 15 when environmental despair hit me pretty hard. I was learning about concepts like biodiversity collapse and global warming, and for a 15-year-old, it was really overwhelming, and I felt really hopeless and I felt really alone. So I remember talking to a mentor about this, and she basically asked me, "Why are you taking the whole world on your shoulders?" And on that day, I experienced a shift in my mindset. And I decided that if I was able to contribute to the well-being of one small corner of this earth, then I would feel happy and satisfied. So with that, the purpose of this presentation today is to spark a little bit of hope and energy. Some of you may have been working in invasive species management for decades, or some of you may be completely new to invasive species, but I'm sure you haven't escaped news stories about climate change and the end of the world. And learning about invasive species for the first time might feel like, oh, look, here's another global problem that we cannot solve. It's really easy to look up at the fields of garlic mustard or buckthorn that continue to degrade the landscapes, but it takes a bit more intention to look back at the habitat that you have helped and feel accomplished from that. So today's presentation is to remind you that those little corners are essential and that any global impact is just an accumulation of local effects. So I moved to Toronto about 6 years ago, and my first impression, I did not like it at all. It was ugly and sticky and loud and felt really cold and impersonal. But soon I discovered that what made Toronto special was that it is a place of intersections and diversity. I have never lived somewhere with so many cultures coexisting in the same space. And even within this small little sliver labeled Aboriginal, you'll see that Toronto, or Takaranto, which is the Mohawk name, there's a diverse presence and history of Indigenous people. There's ancient portage trails, meeting places, settlements, and a very deep history of land stewardship from many diverse Indigenous groups. And today, Takaranto is home to the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit. And definitely many more individuals from other nations, which I haven't named. So from an ecological lens, Toronto is also at a unique intersection. The city region lies between the transition zone between two forest biomes. The northern purple is the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, and the southern brown is the Carolinian forest. So you'll find features of both forest types within the Toronto region. Geologically, the north of the city is bordered by ancient glacial landform, which is called the Oak Ridges Moraine. And on the west, it's hugged by the Niagara Escarpment. So both of these landforms create the river systems and contribute to the ecosystem that makes up the Toronto urban center. Now, the ravines, we call them the ravines, but they're forests. Some of them are steep, some of them are not, but the ravines and natural areas are the remnants of the previous landscapes, the ones that survived urbanizations. They're like veins around the major rivers, the Humber, the Don, and the Rouge, or like the meat that's left on the bones. Now, although they're only a remnant of the past, they actually cover 17% of the land area, which is quite a lot for a densely urban city. And Toronto's actually being called a city within a park. Now, as you know, quantity does not equal quality. So I think many of you will be familiar with this part of the story. In the past half century, there's been a huge decline in biodiversity and ecosystem health, and a huge increase in invasive plants. And researchers and scientists started to ring the warning bells as early as the 70s. And slowly, the public started paying attention in the past several decades. So that there was awareness that the ravines are in critical state. There's invasive species taking control, and we're in a fight for invasive species, and there's ecological collapse is imminent. So all this, scary news headlines. It became clear that without intervention, we were going to continue on this trajectory. So in 2017, the City of Toronto developed the Ravine Strategy, which is a management plan to take care of the 11,000 hectares of natural area. So now we're in this position of increased awareness and a citywide management plan. However, if you were an individual or a community group who wanted to be involved and do something about it, you would have been faced with a roadblock. And the city bylaws prohibit any removal of biomaterial in the ravines. These were originally created to protect fragile ecosystems, which is important, but it also prohibits stewardship from happening. So as a regular member of the public, you're not allowed to remove invasive plants, and you're not allowed to plant native plants. So now there's all these people and groups that are becoming more and more aware of the garlic mustard or dog strangling vine growing in their local ravine or park, but all they can do is watch it go to seed and spread year after year. The Ravine Strategy actually highlights this issue. It acknowledges that there are people who want to be more involved and that the city must work in partnership with the community. It also recognizes that there's limited capacity from the city funding to supervise or train these people, and a lack of a framework that allows community stewardship to happen. So that's where Toronto Nature Stewards comes in. Our mission is to answer this call by opening the door to community-led stewardship in Toronto. Toronto Nature Stewards entered into partnership with the City of Toronto in 2021 to develop a pilot program of community-led stewardship. Volunteers that are qualified to identify and remove invasive plants on public land without city resources or staff. So the model was that TNS would train volunteers to become what we call lead stewards, and they would have official permission from the city to lead up to 10 regular stewards on public land. We launched the pilot in June of 2021 with a small group of 9 sites and 23 lead stewards. Now, in the terms of this program, TNS does the training and develops the administration and reporting system. And the city's role is to co-develop the program terms and approve new stewardship sites. TNS acts as the single point of contact between these stewardship groups and the city. We operate on a decentralized model. So that means each stewardship site is self-contained, and several of them actually come from existing groups such as Friends of groups and other organizations like residents associations or Cliff Crest Butterfly Way, which is a David Suzuki Foundation. Just organizations wanting to do more, be involved. There's also a lot of individuals who are just passionate about their local ravine. And I should also mention that there are many partners and organizations before us that have done a lot of the groundwork in terms of advocacy for the ravines and stewardship, and we would not be here today without them. So let's talk a little bit more about the training program. We run lead steward training in the winter online over Zoom. As the weather gets warmer, we plan some field trips to get together and do some hands-on learning. And the photos you see above are some examples from our past field trips. We call the trainees LSITs, or lead stewards in training, and we train about 20 to 40 each year since 2021. The topics that we cover include invasive plant identification and best removal practices, safety and recruitment and everything about managing your volunteer group, reporting and monitoring, and in our training, we emphasize the Bradley method, which means you start from the best areas with the most native plants, and then you gradually move into the more difficult areas. So I'm going to show you a little example from our training. This is something that we used this year that I created using little icons of plants. As you can see, there's a lot of garlic mustard, which is these green ones on the left. And as you go down, there's a mix of a healthy population of native goldenrods and asters. So applying the Bradley method, you would probably want to remove these little garlic mustards within the native patch first and gradually move up into the more infested areas. You can also see, though, that there's a rare trillium amongst the plant, the garlic mustard here. So that provides a little bit of a challenge of prioritization. This exercise was meant to encourage the process of prioritization and problem solving and develop these skills, which we hope lead stewards would apply to their own sites when they have their own different plant populations and challenges. So once lead steward training is completed and the person becomes a lead steward, the lead stewards really form the heart of the organization. So they do everything. They gather community and recruit their volunteers. Then they impart the training to their stewards and educate the public within their community. And of course, they get the work done. So what is the work? The restoration activities that stewardship groups undertake include primarily removing invasive species and cleaning up litter. And here's the current list of species that we actively remove. And excitingly, this year, we started a pilot of planting native plants at select sites. So filling in the spaces where the invasive species have been removed is imperative to prevent reinvasion. So being able to plant native plants in those spaces gives that piece of land a better fighting chance. One of the key priorities for TNS when developing the model was to make sure that it was both sustainable and scalable. So just to throw some statistics at you guys, this year we've already had 5,000 stewardship hours over 400 events. And since our launch in 2021, it's been about 12.5 thousand hours, which is the equivalent of 6 full-time staff. Most of their sites run their sessions on a regular basis. Usually they're weekly or bi-weekly. And on average, each site gets about 8 to 12 stewardship hours per week. And all of this is at a very minimal cost. This is all possible because of the decentralized model. Bringing back this diagram, I just want to highlight how important consistency is and how consistent stewardship is possible when the people who are doing it have a strong personal connection with the land they're stewarding. They live close by or it's part of their community. They can go week after week and really develop that personal connection. So the consistency is key in making sure that this program is both sustainable and scalable. We also do have this kind of episodic stewardship. We call these pop-up events. So our pop-up events are a great chance for collaboration and to generate energy amongst the community and with partners. We've had events with school groups. We've had events with university groups. We did some support to some indigenous groups with planting sweetgrass. We had researchers come in. We did some searching for jumping worms at one of our sites. We've done collaborations with newcomer organizations to encourage more connection with their local parks and ravines. We've had corporations come out and do some volunteer work. And we've also done, we have an artist in residence who did some work with turning dog strangling vine into cord and working with other uses of invasive plants. And many other collaborations have happened in the past across the sites. So since launching in 2021 with a relatively small group, we've seen a massive increase in numbers. So in 2022, we pretty much doubled. And now in 2023, we're at 32 sites with 100 hectares and nearly 100 lead stewards. I have to say that having been involved since 2021, we barely did any outreach and advertising. There was really a strong accumulation of passion and drive for stewardship that predated TNS, and it was like a dam broke loose once the pilot started. To me, it always kind of felt like a bee's hive, and all you had to do was poke it and a whole swarm of bees would come out. So it just really shows how much people have been wanting to do this and been wanting to get involved in a more direct way. So here we are today with 32 sites in 2023. And now I'm going to spend a bit of time telling you the stories of two of these sites. So the first story, the first story takes place in the center of the city on the Don River. Roxborough Parquet. It's a story of overcoming Sisyphus. So Sisyphus in ancient Greek mythology was someone who was condemned to push a boulder up a hill for eternity. And I've often heard invasive species work described this way, that it's an endless, fruitless task with no results. So the site here, Roxborough Parquet, it's a small site. It's about 1 hectare. On the north and east sides, there's private property that borders the site, and it's connected to the Don River through Yellow Creek. It was one of the original pilot sites, so it began stewardship in June of 2021. And that's Sisyphus. Just to go a little bit more in depth about the site, there's 3 main habitats. One, there's kind of a meadow. I say meadow in brackets because it was heavily disturbed upon first arrival, but it does receive full sun. A lot of the disturbance is due to a construction event in 2020 that caused a lot of compaction and dumping of fill, so the soil was really quite degraded. There's also a woodland area, and it was stewarded in the past, in the 90s, by Urban Forestry Associates, which is an ecological restoration company. They planted quite a lot of native plants and trees, and many of which have survived. And there's also a very special wetland area, which comes from an aquifer that comes from a private property, and it creates some streams that meander. And I've been to the site quite a few times, and it feels like you've walked into a secret treasure, because you would never expect it from where it's located on next to Mount Pleasant, which is a busy road. And there's a lot of wetland species and birds that live there. So starting with the meadow, as I mentioned, the challenge of the compact soil makes it really vulnerable to invasion by those invasive plants. And there was a lot of garlic mustard primarily there. So the approach of the steward were to remove the invasive plants, and for the non-reproductive parts of those plants to leave it on the soil and leave that biomaterial there to hope to generate some kind of soil restoration. It was one of the sites that participated in planting this year, so we were able to plant native herbaceous species in the meadow. Just to show you some preliminary results. Here's May of 2021 when we first started. You can see it's really compact, and the only plant there with the white flowers it's pretty much all garlic mustard. In 2022, just after 1 year of stewardship, there was already a pretty big shift. So the plant that's remaining is the native goldenrod. And in 2023, as I said, we were able to plant several native species. So these are the 3 species that the group planted there in the meadow. Now, some more pictures. Here's a really good view of the site before stewardship in 2021. Huge difference that a year can make. And in 2023, it's continuing to improve. And now, as I mentioned, there are bergamot, oxeye, and New England asters in the mix. So really positive results, even just after 3 years for the meadow. And now let's go into the woodland. So as I mentioned, there was some previous stewardship in the 90s, but the challenge is that now after several decades, a lot of the invasive species are threatening those original plantings and stewardship work. So there was a lot of stewardship effort that was put into this site. In 2021, over 200 hours of work was put in with 21 volunteers, and a similar amount in 2022. So the number of volunteers didn't grow very much, but the people who came were returning. It was a really dedicated crew with lots of different knowledge and expertise amongst the people. Here's a before picture with garlic mustard in the forest floor and after it's been removed. And here's some pictures of some of the stewards with their proud handfuls of, that's I think creeping bellflower and dog strangling vine. Okay, and I saved the best for last, it's the wetland. So the challenge of the wetland is a pretty large patch of Japanese knotweed. And the knotweed is on the northern border of the site, so it has spillover from one of the private properties. The terrain is mucky and uneven and quite sensitive to disturbance. So you can see the knotweed here on the left, and here's the stewards of Roxborough. The upside is that there was an existing population of native plants. So there was common jewelweed predominantly and some willow species. And there's a dedicated team at Roxborough, as I mentioned, and several of them have a deeper interest into ecological monitoring. So we were able to do a little bit more in-depth monitoring of the site, and I'll show you some of the preliminary results on the next slide. So in the removal phase, the technique was actually to clip the stems. And for those of you who are familiar with Japanese knotweed, you're probably thinking, oh, they're just going to come back because they grow from the rhizomes will continue to produce stems, and that is true. The reason clipping was the technique that was chosen was because of, as I mentioned, the mucky terrain and the existing populations of natives. So we didn't want to disturb the jewelweed, and we also wanted to ensure the safety of the stewards. So clipping happens 3 to 4 times in the season, and the stems and the leaves are actually left to decompose, and those piles are monitored for regrowth. So far, there has been like none, if any, very little regrowth in these piles. So that's been an effective strategy for Roxborough. For the monitoring, we set up a 10 by 10 meter plot, and we took a few measures, including a visual percent cover and a stem count of the Japanese knotweed. We also took photo points, and this all started in 2022, in the second year of stewardship at Roxborough. So the picture on the right with the little flags, that's us doing a stem count. So each flag, I think, represented like 100 stems or something like that, and we would count as we cut. So some preliminary results. The first view, or the first photo point. Here's the site in 2022, and those big leaves, you can see, the knotweed is the dominant species. Here is after removal, so the empty space is where the knotweed was taken out, and the remaining plants, the remaining green, is jewelweed, which is the native. And later in the season, the jewelweed was in bloom, and it was just a beautiful difference within 1 year. Now this year, it's a little bit harder to tell, but before stewardship in July, a lot of these plants, the ones with the leaves that are a little bit more wiggly, are the jewelweed, but you can still see some of the knotweed hiding underneath. They're definitely less dominant and less big. Here's the after. So the jewelweed population that's left over seems to be more healthy, and we will see what happens in September. Here's the second photo point view. Okay, here's the before, and in this picture you can see some of the native willows as well. All Japanese knotweed. Here's the after removal, and again in September. Now this year, very similar pattern happening. We see the knotweed and the jewelweed kind of at even playing grounds now. A lot of the jewelweed was left over after removing the knotweed, and in September we will see. So within the 10 by 10 meter plot, I mentioned we did a few extra measures of abundance. So last year, so these are the measures that were taken before any stewardship started for the year. So in 2022, the knotweed was the dominant species, as you can see from the photo, between 50 to 75%, and the jewelweed was between 26 to 50. And so in 2023, they flipped dominance, which is really encouraging after just 2 years. And the knotweed started off in the season on the low end. We also discovered a few new species within the 10 by 10 meter plot. So riverbank grape made its way in, which is a native plant, and also an invasive plant called bittersweet nightshade. There was I think a few stems. So this is also another example of how monitoring is useful for early detection, rapid response. So the stewards can just pluck out that nightshade before it gets to grow in population. Now, in terms of stem count, the 2022 cut was 1,600 stems, and the 2023 cut was 1,300 stems. So not a huge difference, but we did notice that the stems were significantly smaller. And you can see in the after photos how much less space they took up in the second year. So speaking of the stem count, we learned, a potential caveat to it is that just because the stem count is lower or higher, it might not necessarily reflect the strength of the invasive plant population because of the size differences. So this is the same root ball, but in the red circle, that's the stems cut in 2021, and there are fewer stems, they're thicker. In 2022, there's more stems and they're thinner. So to adjust to this, this caveat, we started to measure size classes after we did our first cut. So we did small and large as 2 different size classes, and we hope that that will reveal a bit more than just a number. So the story is not over yet. As I mentioned earlier, the spillover from the Japanese knotweed comes from a private property, and this is a photo. The fence actually fell over and the knotweed coming in from there. So what happened was in 2022, the lead stewards wrote a letter to the homeowner asking for their help and explaining a little bit of the situation. And in 2023, I just heard that the homeowners actually agreed to hire a local restoration company to fix the fence and remove the knotweed from their property. And that company is actually the same one that did the planting in the 90s. So that's a really cool full circle moment. And here's just a quote from their letter. So the reason I wanted to highlight this part of the story was because it's beyond just the site. 40% of Toronto's ravines are actually on private property. So so far I've only been talking about public property, but if you go on our website, you'll see that we actually have a whole section dedicated to private land. So this Roxborough story is a really great example of what collaboration could look like and how nature knows no borders. So we need to really work together and think of creative solutions. Okay, so that's the first story. Next, I am going to tell you the story of Train the Trainer and a story of the ripple effect. It takes place in the east end of the city, and the site in question is called Highland Creek. So Highland Creek is 3 times larger than Roxborough. It's frequented by dog walkers, cyclists, joggers, and walkers. And there's a lot of invasive plants there, all the common ones. And this site started in 2022, so in the second year of the program. I'm going to tell the story through the testimonial of the lead steward of Highland Creek, whose name is Salima. So starting off, Salima was very daunted by the prospect of being a lead steward. She was the only one at this site, this very large site, and joined us with just an inkling of knowledge of dog strangling vine, but with a lot of drive and passion. So the site being large and having many invasive plants was quite intimidating to begin with. And there's a picture on the right of Highland Creek, and you can see all the dog strangling vine on the forest floor. Salima took lead steward training in 2022 and discovered a culture of mentorship and support. The lead steward from Ashbridges Bay, which was one of our pilot sites in 2021, and Purvis, she helped Salima get started. They walked the site together. They helped the stewardship plan and map out the site, and really did a lot of mentorship in that. There was another site called Sunny Point Nielsen, which is at Scarborough Bluffs, and they had 3 lead stewards. They also began in 2022, and they showed support by attending Salima's sessions, so she wasn't alone. As spring rolled around, Salima had her first few sessions. So it began with a small group, and they were all learning together as they went. Although the group was small, the people kept returning week after week, and they started to develop some community and camaraderie for the site. Now they started to gain momentum as they began feeling the rewards of stewardship. Eventually, they created their own Instagram page. They got a letter of recognition from their local city councillor, and they even made it to the local newspaper as well. They got into a very good rhythm. And the more time that they spent in Highland Creek, the more they discovered of its various inhabitants. So one of our TNS exercises is to create a plant inventory. And as Highland Creek stewards spent more time looking into the details, putting the trowel down for a second and trying to discover the other native plants that were living there, it really was a fuel for the hope and the drive to take a look at the species that you are protecting. So all of these pictures were actually taken at Highland Creek, and I was just amazed when I saw them, all the different kind of plants that were living there. Now in 2023, the site is still going strong, and some of the stewards have taken on some special projects like creating a more detailed mapping system, or taking before and after photos and managing their social media. And just as a full circle, Salima has said that in 2 short years, she's gone from knowing nothing to receiving training and leading her own group of stewards. some of whom are now lead stewards and have adopted sites of their own. When I think about the dog strangling vine that set all of this off for me back in 2021, I imagine that the community of stewards that TNS is building is growing faster than any invasive plant possibly could. Now, to continue the story of the ripple effect, as mentioned, several lead stewards, actually 5 out of 8 of their regular stewards, ended up taking the training to become a lead stewards last winter, and they joined several sites also in the East End. And Salima was able to be a mentor for them, just as she had been mentored in the past. Now, here's a quote from one of the lead stewards that went from Highland Creek, sorry, there's a typo there actually, to Birkdale, not Hop Tree, Misty Hills. And actually in 2024, at least 4 more people within this network will be taking lead steward training, and there's also an intention to apply to even more sites. So the ripple effect continues. Okay. Now, I could go into details to all of these sites, probably an hour for every site, but we'd be here every day, all day. So that was just and I wanted to end with this little slogan. It's kind of our unofficial slogan. And end with a few quotes. So this is a Chinese proverb saying, the person who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones. Just back to the original kind of message and theme of this presentation is that these little stories and these, once you zoom out, of course, it looks small, but they, oh, sorry, but you just got to begin. You just got to start somewhere. And from one of my favorite books, Braiding Sweetgrass, despair is paralysis. It robs us of agency. It blinds us to our own power and the power of the earth. And restoration is a powerful antidote to despair. So I'll end there. If you want to get in contact, there's our information, and I'll open up the floor to any questions. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Okay, thank you, Anna. That was great. So once again, if anyone had any questions for Anna regarding her presentation, feel free to leave them in the chat, and I can go ahead and read those aloud to her. So the first question that we have is, are you funded by the City of Toronto?
We are not funded by the City of Toronto, so we get a lot of our funding from private donors and grants and that kind of thing, and outreach and stuff like that. So the City of Toronto provides their staff time to support the program in terms of reviewing the site applications and attending meetings and stuff like that, but we don't get any funding.
Awesome. Okay. The next question we have is, what kind of staff time and oversight and how many staff are required to oversee training of lead stewards and managing, or is it entirely volunteer-led?
That's a really good question. So it's fluctuated between like 1 to 3 staff. Right now we have 3 staff full-time to oversee, the website and the training, the communications, but it is very, very volunteer driven. So in our leadership and operations team and our curriculum team, they're mostly volunteers. So some specific volunteers will step up and, take on a bit more of a chunk beyond just their regular stewardship.
Okay. The next question we have is, we've been trying to get the city interested in the train the trainer model. At this point, most groups just train themselves using resources like the councils and then train the volunteers. Our argument is that ground crews could be trained as well to help spot early problems. Any advice you have that could help us leapfrog over common challenges?
It's a really good question. So yeah, I should mention that Toronto is not the first city to do this train the trainer model. I think it's Seattle has a similar one. I recently learned about one in Washington, DC, and I think London, Ontario also has one. So it's not a new concept. But I think there is definitely, each municipality has its own unique challenges and its own unique dynamic that takes some time to figure out. So any advice that you have could help leapfrog over common challenges. I think one of the things is getting support from your counselors is important as well, to kind of show that it's not just not just one group that wants to do something, but that it's really to keep kind of knocking on the door and saying, like, we're here, we want to do this, and to continue that persistence. Because eventually, in Toronto's case, there was, as I mentioned, there was a lot of advocacy that preceded Toronto Nature Stewards. So it's kind of it's a long haul. In terms of training, so some common challenges being, you don't really want to reinvent the wheel, and there's a lot of resources out there. So one piece of advice I would give you would be to, well, one, get in contact with, and also we got a lot of our best practices from, Invasive Species Center. Invent the wheel, but just adapt it to your own specific situation.
Awesome, thank you. The next question we have is wonderful and inspiring. How is liability insurance handled by TNS? I am in Ottawa, and our smaller organizations are often not incorporated and may not have liability insurance of their own.
Yeah, good question. So we are insured, but we are not incorporated. And how that works is I think we joined as a member of Ontario groups, and we got our insurance through that. I said we're not incorporated of U of T, University of Toronto. And that's where the roots of the organization have begun. So for example, donations would go through the university, or staffing goes through the university. But that's obviously a special case. So for a small organization, I would suggest partnering up with a bigger organization to start with, and seeing if you could get some of the more legal and official stuff through them.
Okay, we have one comment here that says, sorry, audio keeps cutting out. Could you repeat the organization you joined?
Oh, sorry about that. I guess there were some internet issues. The organization is called Toronto Nature Stewards.
Perfect, thank you. The next question we have is, do you use any digital tools to communicate and log hours?
Yes, good question. So it took us a while to kind of figure out how to do this effectively without too much sort of administrative burden for both the volunteers and for the people who were managing it. And where we're still, fine-tuning this every year, but we predominantly use Google Forms and Google Suite to collect hours and data and monitoring from our lead stewards. So we just create a Google form with the questions and send it out. We also have a section on our website just for our volunteers, so they can log in and get to all of that, all of those necessary links and forms that they need. But yeah, this is like one of the challenges that we've been trying to grapple with, to make it as streamlined as possible. And not onerous on the volunteers, but still collect useful information. So right now we are using Google Suite. In terms of other communication tools, we use Zoom to do our training, and we also communicate by email, and we have a Facebook group for our volunteers. So we kind of do a little bit of a lot of different things, but we don't want technology to be a barrier to stewardship.
Okay, so I think we have time for a couple more questions. The next one is, what is your relationship with the University of Toronto Forestry?
Okay, good question. So the research group that I mentioned at the beginning, called Toronto Ravine Revitalization Science, they did a study in the 70s to survey the ravine, and found, we're sort of one of the first to call the warning bells for invasive species in the ravines. And they resurveyed in 2017 and came up with a pretty extensive report. And that formed a group that did, beyond just research, they also did a lot of community outreach, and that was the TRRS. So when TNS formed, it actually was an evolution out of TNS, and a lot of the original members of the study are still part of TNS today. So that research group at U of T, and that's how TNS has a continuing relationship with the university. And I myself was a student at the university, and the other two staff people as well. So we were in the forestry conservation program, and that connection with TNS allowed us to have that opportunity open for us as well.
Okay, so I believe this is our last question. Where do your best management practices come from?
Yeah, good question. So as I mentioned, we know that there's a lot of great resources out there already. So a lot of our best management practices come from various sources, a lot from the OIPC and Invasive Species Center work, but we definitely do have to adapt them for our program, because, for example, our volunteers can't use herbicides or motorized tools, so we need to take out any mention of that and extract some of that information. So we make 1 to 2 page like info sheets on each invasive plants for our volunteers, hopefully short enough that they can take into the field and use. And we also have quite a lot of in-house expertise, so some of the recommendations also come from the experience of local experts.
Okay, so I think that's all the time we have. So if you had any other questions for Anna, you could email us at info@invasivespeciescenter.ca, or you could reach Anna directly with her her contact information that she left. So I just want to say thank you again for Anna for talking with us today and for presenting, and thank you all for tuning in. This webinar was recorded and will be posted on our website at invasivespeciescenter.ca. And please stay tuned for future webinars, and have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.